The Ashford family had always been a fixture of whispered conversation. Their name, though spoken in hushed tones, was known across the region for one thing above all: wealth. The Ashfords were a dynasty. They owned estates far and wide, their riches seemingly endless, their influence stretching into every corner of society. From their towering Gothic mansion nestled atop the hill to the elegant ivy-covered gates that guarded the entrance, their legacy was both grand and suffocating. The mansion itself, once a gleaming symbol of prosperity, was now draped in an unsettling air, as though its very walls whispered forgotten stories. Generations of Ashfords had lived and died within the mansion's cold stone walls. But it was the sisters, Evelyn and Isabel, who truly embodied the family's enigmatic presence. Beautiful, poised, and always impeccably dressed, they were the epitome of grace. Two young women who seemed untouched by the passing years. Their faces graced every social gathering. Their names spoke of refinement and old money. Yet there was something that set them apart, something unsettling. The townsfolk, ever curious and endlessly fascinated by the Ashford family's apparent perfection, couldn't help but speculate. No one had ever seen Evelyn or Isabel laugh openly in public. They were distant, their smiles cryptic. Behind their composed appearances, the sisters seemed like figures carved from marble. Beautiful, yes, but lifeless in a way that made people uneasy. And though they rarely spoke of their family history, there were rumors. Dark rumors. It was said that the Ashfords weren't simply wealthy but cursed. The curse of their bloodline, inherited through generations, was something whispered about but never spoken openly. It was an unspoken truth, carried on the breath of the wind as it rustled through the ivy on the mansion's walls. In every generation of Ashfords, there were tales of strange disappearances, deaths that seemed to come too early, too violently. Every few decades, one member of the family would vanish, leaving nothing but a trace of blood and a lingering sense of dread. Yet despite the rumors, the Ashfords maintained their place at the top. Their money bought silence, their power demanded respect, and the mansion, despite its whispers, remained untouched by time. And for a while, it seemed as though the curse had forgotten them. But then, there were the sisters. Evelyn and Isabel had never seemed like the sort to follow the fate of those who came before them. They were different. At least, that's what the townspeople had hoped. They were educated, eloquent, always seen together, inseparable. In public, they were a vision of perfection, genteel, refined, untouched by the world's evils. Behind the closed doors of the Ashford mansion, however, the whispers persisted. The sisters were aware of it, of course. Their inherited wealth and privilege had come with a heavy price, and though they never spoke of the rumors, they lived in the shadow of them. They had seen the portrait of their ancestors hanging in the grand hallway, each face colder than the last, their eyes hollow and distant. They had heard the stories from their servants, the old maids who still worked in the house, stories about the strange lights that flickered in the windows on stormy nights, the figures that seemed to walk the halls when no one was around. The sisters had long since dismissed these tales, too intelligent to believe in such childish things, but beneath the surface of their composed exterior, a quiet fear began to grow. For years, the Ashfords had remained untouched by tragedy, but there were days when Isabel would catch Evelyn staring at the family portrait, her gaze not filled with admiration, but with something else, something dark and the unsettling thought that perhaps the curse had not been forgotten but simply biding its time. Then one night it all changed. It was a warm summer evening, the kind where the air is thick with the scent of earth and the promise of thunderstorms. The sisters had gone out for their usual walk by the lake, their figures slender and graceful beneath the full moon's glow. The world around them was calm, serene. Nothing could have prepared anyone for what was to come. By morning, Evelyn and Isabel were gone, vanished. No trace, no sign of where they had gone, just the silence that followed them, a silence that would haunt the mansion forever. The night Evelyn and Isabel Ashford disappeared was like any other summer evening. The sky was a perfect shade of indigo, dotted with the soft flickering light of 1,000 stars. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that wrapped around you like a blanket, almost suffocating in its warmth. The sound of crickets sang through the thick silence of the Ashford estate, the only other noise the gentle rustle of leaves stirred by the evening breeze. It was a full moon that night, casting its pale light across the manicured grounds of the estate, turning every shadow into something darker, more sinister. The sisters were last seen standing near the lake, just beyond the edge of the garden. The lake, serene and still, was a place they often visited together, a quiet refuge away from the prying eyes of the town. They had always enjoyed the tranquil solitude it offered, their laughter floating across the still water, rippling the surface like the echoes of their voices. But that night, the sound of their laughter was the last anyone heard. As the evening wore on, the sisters remained by the lake, their silhouettes visible in the distance as they walked along the shore. The light from the moon reflected off the water, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. They seemed almost ethereal, two young women, lost in their own world, untouched by the encroaching day, darkness that loomed on the horizon. At some point, one of the servants, a young maid who had been cleaning the kitchen windows, noticed them by the lake. She saw them laughing, talking, perhaps sharing a secret only the two of them knew. But as she turned back to her work, her mind elsewhere, she couldn't have known that this would be the last time she saw them. When the clock struck midnight, the first signs of something amiss appeared. One of the estate's guards, a grizzled old man named Graham, had made his rounds around the perimeter of the mansion and noticed an unsettling silence. The usual rustling of the trees in the wind was gone. The crickets had stopped their songs. The air, thick with tension, seemed to press against him as he walked. He checked the grounds, as was his duty, but when he reached the lake he found nothing. No sign of the sisters, no footsteps in the soft earth, nothing. Just the unsettling calm of the water, reflecting only the still, cold moon. He stood there for a moment, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. It was strange. Evelyn and Isabel were never gone this long without a word. He called out for them, but the sound of his voice was swallowed by the vastness of the night. Nothing answered. Graham, unnerved but determined, made his way back to the mansion. It was too quiet, too still. He reported to the head butler, Charles, who had grown accustomed to the oddities of the Ashford estate, but even he was taken aback by the sudden disappearance. He instructed the staff to begin searching the grounds, hoping for some trace of the sisters. Hours passed. The mansion, once vibrant with the hum of daily life, now felt like a tomb. The once bright windows seemed to stare blankly into the night, as though even the house itself were holding its breath. The search grew frantic, expanding beyond the estate walls and into the surrounding woods. By the time the local authorities arrived, the entire town had been roused from their sleep, their curiosity piqued by the sudden mysterious event. But there was nothing, not a trace, not a single clue. The search stretched for days. Every inch of the estate, every path near the lake, and every corner of the forest surrounding Ashford Manor was combed by authorities, but there was nothing to be found. No footprints in the grass, no discarded pieces of clothing, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the sisters had vanished into thin air, swallowed whole by the very ground they had walked on. The community was left in shock, unable to comprehend the unthinkable. How could two young women so full of life, so seemingly invulnerable, simply disappear without a trace? Whispers began to spread like wildfire. Had they run away? Had something sinister happened? Or had they, like so many of the Ashfords before them, simply been claimed by the curse that haunted their bloodline? Even the most optimistic theories were quickly dismissed. Evelyn and Isabel had been seen hours earlier, laughing and enjoying their evening by the lake. It was impossible to imagine they would have left willingly, especially without a word to anyone. As the days dragged on, the grief-stricken family struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. Each family member responded in their own way, some with quiet resolve, others with open despair, but no one could make sense of the unfathomable void the sisters had left behind. The police, though thorough in their investigation, found themselves stymied. No one had seen or heard anything unusual that night. No one could explain how the sisters could vanish so completely, so utterly. It wasn't as though they'd run off into the woods or hidden themselves away in some distant part of the mansion. It was as if they had simply disappeared. The entire town felt the loss, but no one more so than the Ashfords themselves. The family, long known for their impenetrable walls, was now fractured, lost in the silence left behind by their beloved daughters. As the days passed, each family member was consumed by their own thoughts, their own suspicions. Were they victims of the same fate that had claimed so many Ashfords before them, or was there something more sinister at work? And as the investigation stalled, the chilling reality set in. The sisters were gone, and no one, nothing, could bring them back. The Ashford family had always been known for its wealth, power, and impeccable social standing, but beneath the polished surface of their public image, there was a far darker truth, a history stained with blood, betrayal, and a curse that had festered for generations. It was a history that the Ashfords themselves had worked tirelessly to bury, to hide from the world, and yet, despite their efforts, the shadows of their past refused to stay buried. The family's patriarch, Jonathan Ashford, had been a man of great ambition. When he first arrived in the village, a young man with little more than an iron will and a keen eye for business, no one could have predicted the dark legacy he would leave behind. By the time he settled in the area, he was already whispering of great promises, of fortunes made through shady deals, of alliances with people whose names were only spoken in fear. And it was through these alliances that Jonathan Ashford began to rise, quickly making a name for himself as a man with his fingers in every pie. But it wasn't just business that Jonathan had a talent for, it was people. The women in the village, allured by his charm and wealth, would often find themselves at the mercy of his manipulation. He was rumored to have taken many lovers, some of whom vanished under mysterious circumstances. Others claimed that Jonathan had always been a man of strange habits, prone to disappearing for days, re-emerging with a look of haunted madness in his eyes, as if he had and something that could never be erased. But these rumors, while unsettling, were only the beginning. What truly set the Ashford family apart from the rest was a chilling secret passed down through the generations, one that had been carefully hidden in the deepest corners of their mansion. And it was this secret, buried beneath the layers of time, that would come to light years later when the sisters disappeared. In the early years of Jonathan Ashford's reign, before the mansion had been built and the estate had been established, he had made a pact, one that he believed would secure the Ashford name for all eternity. It was a pact with an unknown entity, a being that promised him power, wealth, and eternal life in exchange for an unspoken price. This price, it turned out, was not gold, nor land, nor anything of tangible value. The price was blood, the blood of the Ashford heirs. Jonathan, in his desperation to leave a legacy greater than any that had come before him, had sacrificed his firstborn child in an ancient ritual that had been passed down through secret bloodlines. The child was never spoken of again, and no one ever asked questions, but the ritual was said to have bound the family to something darker than any human could comprehend. Years went by, and the Ashford family continued to prosper, but with every generation the curse grew stronger, feeding off the family's success. Strange deaths followed the Ashfords like a shadow, each more mysterious than the last. A cousin drowned in the lake under circumstances too strange to explain. Another disappeared while traveling abroad, never to be heard from again. A daughter born of Jonathan's second marriage fell ill at an age too young to explain. Her body found lifeless in the family crypt, and with each death, the whispers grew louder. The sisters, Evelyn and Isabel, had been raised in the shadow of these stories. Their father, Henry Ashford, had never spoken of them directly, but they were always present, an unspoken knowledge that lingered like the scent of old dust in the mansion's air. Henry had done his best to distance himself from the rumors of their bloodline, keeping to the social circles that praised their family's wealth and grandeur, but even he could not escape the weight of the family's history. As children, Evelyn and Isabel were often told that their ancestors were great men and women, that their legacy was one of honor and respect. But even as young girls, they could sense that there was something wrong, something hidden beneath the surface of the carefully crafted stories their father had told them. It wasn't just the portraits that hung in the grand hall, their painted eyes following them wherever they went. It wasn't just the strange symbols that had been carved into the doors and windowsills of the mansion, symbols that the servants refused to explain. It was a feeling, a cold, persistent feeling that something was waiting for them, something that had been waiting for generations. Evelyn, in particular, had always been drawn to the family's hidden history. Late at night, when the rest of the family slept, she would often sneak into the library, where she would search through the old family journals and letters that had been left behind by her ancestors. What she found was enough to chill her to the bone. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, warnings of a curse that had been passed down through the Ashford bloodline. Each generation was marked by tragedy, loss, and strange disappearances, events that no one could explain, but that always seemed to follow the Ashfords wherever they went. Isabel, ever the more practical of the two, dismissed these thoughts as superstition, but even she could not ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to follow them. The cold spots in the mansion, the unexplainable sounds in the night, the sense that someone, something, was watching them, waiting for the moment when the curse would claim them, as it had claimed so many others before them. And then there was the family crypt, an ancient stone structure hidden deep within the estate's grounds. It was a place no one dared to visit, a place where the dead Ashfords were said to rest. The door to the crypt was always locked, its key passed down through the generations. But there were rumors of what lay inside, a secret that even Henry Ashford could not bring himself to face. The Ashfords had long since distanced themselves from the past, but the past had never let them go. The curse of their bloodline had been waiting, hidden beneath the walls of their mansion, festering like a wound that refused to heal. And now, with the disappearance of Evelyn and Isabel, it seemed that the curse was finally claiming its prize. The Ashford family had long been haunted by a secret, one that even the most diligent of historians had failed to uncover, a secret buried deep within the foundation of their fortune. Beneath the wealth, beneath the opulent walls of their mansion, lay an ancient pact made by Jonathan Ashford, the family's first patriarch. It was a pact that would come to define the bloodline, a pact with a dark entity whose name was never spoken aloud, for to do so was said to invoke its wrath. This entity, known only in whispers, had offered Jonathan everything he desired: wealth beyond measure, power over men, and a life free from the grip of death. But in exchange, it demanded a terrible price. The price was not paid immediately. No, Jonathan had been promised time, perhaps even lifetimes, to enjoy the fruits of his deal before the inevitable reckoning. At first it seemed as though he had cheated the darkness, outwitting the very force that had bound him. The Ashfords flourished. Their name became synonymous with fortune, and their estate grew in size and influence. Yet with each passing year, the cost of their wealth became more apparent. As each generation passed, strange occurrences began to plague the Ashford line. The first death had been swift and mysterious, a distant cousin found drowned in the very lake near the estate, though no one could understand how. Then, a second relative vanished without a trace, leaving only a cryptic note behind. The family laughed it off, believing it was nothing more than the whims of scandal and gossip. But the strange deaths didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more violent, as if the curse was tightening its grip with every passing decade. Jonathan Ashford, despite his wealth and power, was not immune to the passage of time. By the time he had reached old age, his body had begun to decay faster than nature intended. He sought solace in the same dark powers that had granted him his fortune, performing rituals in the dead of night in an attempt to stave off death itself. He knew, in the deepest recesses of his mind, that the pact was coming due, that something in the depths of the earth beneath the mansion was waiting for the payment to be made. And yet, even as Jonathan's health deteriorated, the family continued to prosper. The curse, as it turned out, was not a quick demise. Instead, it worked slowly, methodically, passing from one generation to the next like a sickly inheritance. Every heir to the Ashford name would inherit the promise made by Jonathan, and the price that had yet to be paid. In the years that followed, each Ashford heir faced the curse differently. Some ignored the whispers, convinced that they were nothing more than superstitions. Others fought desperately against it, attempting to break the chains that bound them. But it was futile. The Ashford bloodline had been marked, and the curse would not let go. It wasn't until the birth of Evelyn and Isabel that the full weight of the curse became clear to the family. The sisters were the last in a long line of Ashfords, the heirs to Jonathan's dark legacy. Though their father, Henry Ashford, had tried to distance himself from the family's twisted history, there was no escaping the blood that ran through his veins. His daughters, like him, carried the mark of the pact, a mark that had been growing more pronounced with each passing generation. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, Evelyn had been restless. She had begun to have vivid dreams of a shadowed figure standing at the edge of the lake, its eyes glowing red like embers. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the image of the figure still haunting her. Isabel, though outwardly calm, had noticed the change in her sister. Evelyn no longer smiled as brightly. She spent hours poring over old family records, and more than once Isabel had caught her muttering words in a language she couldn't understand. The dreams were not isolated. Isabel too had begun to feel the weight of the curse. The air in the mansion had grown thicker, the walls colder, as if the house itself were alive with the ancient presence of something dark and oppressive. The once beautiful portraits of their ancestors seemed to shift in the corners of her vision, their painted eyes following her wherever she went. But what troubled Isabel the most were the strange, disembodied whispers that had started in the dead of night, voices that called her name in low, guttural tones. One night, Evelyn had confided in her, speaking of the unease that had been building in her chest. "Do you feel it too?" she had asked Isabel. "There's something wrong with the house, something in the blood. I think I've found it, Izzy. The curse. It's real." But even Evelyn, with all her knowledge of the family's dark history, hadn't fully understood the extent of the curse. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that they could escape it, that somehow they could outrun the inevitability of their fate. But as the days passed and the dread grew more tangible, it became clear that the curse had been waiting for them. And now, it had come for them. When Evelyn and Abel disappeared, it was not a random event. The curse had finally claimed them. The whispers of the past, the blood that had been spilled, had all led to this moment. It had always been part of the plan. The pact made by Jonathan Ashford, the promise of ruin, the disappearance of the heirs. The family had lived in denial for too long, but the reckoning was now upon them. The authorities had arrived quickly, but despite their best efforts, there was little to go on. The Ashford estate, once a place of wealth and grandeur, now felt like a tomb, its walls pressing in on everyone who dared to step inside. The disappearance of Evelyn and Isabel Ashford seemed like an unsolvable puzzle, each piece slipping further from reach. The town was rife with whispers, but no one knew what to make of the growing sense of unease that clung to the family's name like a bad omen. The first few days of the investigation passed in a blur. Officers combed the grounds, searched the woods, and questioned every servant on the estate. Yet, no one had seen a thing. The search felt like a fruitless endeavor, as if the sisters had simply vanished into thin air. No signs of struggle, no discarded clothing, nothing to suggest they had been taken against their will. The only evidence was their personal effects, which had been found in strange places. Evelyn's favorite scarf, a silk affair in deep crimson, was discovered neatly folded on a bench beneath the largest oak tree in the estate's garden, as though she had placed it there and walked away. Isabel's delicate silver locket, engraved with a portrait of the two sisters, was found on the ground near the edge of the lake, its chain twisted in a way that suggested it had been tossed carelessly. These items, so intimately tied to the sisters, seemed to tell a story that the investigation could not piece together. Sergeant Edward Banks, a seasoned investigator who had seen his fair share of disappearances, was baffled. "This isn't right," he muttered to his partner, a young officer named Clara, as they walked along the grounds. "They didn't just vanish. Someone's playing a game." Clara, though less experienced, couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. She had examined the sisters' bedroom, and something about it felt off, disjointed, as though it had been disturbed, but not in a way that suggested forced entry. Evelyn's bed was neatly made, as though she had left willingly, but there was a strange, almost imperceptible scent in the air, a mixture of lavender and something darker, something metallic. The wardrobe doors had been left slightly ajar, though nothing inside appeared to be missing. But then there was the journal, Evelyn's journal, which had been tucked away beneath a pile of neatly folded sheets. The pages inside were filled with strange symbols that didn't seem to belong to any language she knew. Cryptic notes written in a hurried scrawl spoke of a final reckoning, of the blood that calls, and of the price to be paid. These notes sent chills down Clara's spine. She had seen enough strange cases to know when something wasn't right, but this was different. She felt like she was being led somewhere, being drawn into a story far larger than the simple disappearance of two young women. The deeper the investigation went, the stranger the clues became. One morning, an officer searching the study uncovered a family portrait hanging on the wall. It was an old portrait, one that had been passed down through generations, and it depicted the Ashford family as it had been many years ago. The faces were stern, their eyes hauntingly vacant, each figure seemingly frozen in time. But as the officer examined it more closely, he noticed something. Unusual. In the background, behind the main family members, there was a shadowy figure, barely visible, standing just beyond the edge of the frame. At first, the officer assumed it was merely a trick of the light, an anomaly caused by the aging of the canvas. But upon closer inspection, it became clear that the figure was not a trick. It was a person, a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs, its features obscured by darkness. Its eyes were glinting in the faint light of the painting, and there was something about the way it stood that made the officer's blood run cold. He took a step back, his hand trembling as he reached for his radio. "I think you need to see this." When Sergeant Banks arrived, he looked at the painting, his face hardening. "That figure, it's always been there, right?" The officer nodded, his voice hesitant. "Yes, but I've never seen it so clearly before. It doesn't look like anyone from the family." Banks stared at the figure, his mind racing. He had heard the rumors of strange occurrences in the Ashford house, of figures seen in the corners of eyes, of fleeting shadows, but he had dismissed them as superstition. But now, standing before the painting, with the figure's eerie presence looming over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was unfolding. As the days wore on, the investigation grew more bizarre. The town was on edge, every person suspecting the other. Had the sisters staged their own disappearance? Were they hiding out somewhere, attempting to escape the pressures of their family's legacy? It seemed like the most logical explanation, but the deeper they dug, the more disjointed everything became. A letter was found, tucked away in a drawer in the sisters' study. It was addressed to no one in particular, written in a spidery hand that was unmistakably Evelyn's, but the contents made no sense. It spoke of a final offering, and an ancient promise that cannot be undone. It ended abruptly with the chilling sentence, "They will come for us." Was this a cry for help, a warning, or was it part of a carefully constructed ruse to lead the investigators down a path that would only end in confusion and despair? It seemed that with every clue, the investigation grew more labyrinthine, like an intricate puzzle with pieces that refused to fit together. There were no answers, only more questions. It was as though someone, or something, was guiding them in circles, playing with their minds, forcing them to chase shadows that would never be caught. As the search stretched on with no new leads, the town grew quieter, the uncertainty heavier. Every day that passed seemed to erode the hope of finding Evelyn and Isabel. The haunting mystery only deepened, and it became painfully clear. The Ashford family was not merely suffering from a tragic loss. They were trapped in something much darker, something far beyond the reach of the authorities. The days following Evelyn and Isabel's disappearance brought with them an air of suffocating dread that clung to the Ashford mansion like a second skin. What had once been a home of grandeur, filled with echoes of laughter and idle chatter, now seemed like a place of no return. The walls themselves appeared to groan under the weight of the family's unraveling sanity, as if they too were aware that something far darker than mere tragedy was at play. Henry Ashford, once a proud and stoic man, became increasingly withdrawn. The first few days after the sisters' vanishing were spent in a haze of denial. He refused to believe that his daughters were gone, as if somehow he could will them back into existence by sheer force of will. He avoided speaking of the curse, even though he had known deep down that it was never a matter of if, but when. The whispers from the servants, the cryptic journal entries, and the haunting family portrait had been more than enough to convince him that the curse had come home to roost, but Henry clung to a stubborn disbelief, refusing to acknowledge what seemed so obvious to everyone else. His wife Margaret fared no better. Once a woman of sharp wit and commanding presence, she became consumed by grief, then anger, then suspicion. She had been the first to suggest that the girls had staged their disappearance, run away to escape the suffocating world of the Ashfords. But deep down, she knew this was a lie. The house was too quiet without them, the air too heavy, and the sight of their empty rooms only seemed to feed the growing sense of unease in her chest. She would often find herself staring at the walls, her fingers tracing the edges of the family portraits, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. Margaret's descent into paranoia began in earnest when she heard the whispers, soft, barely audible voices that seemed to call her name in the dead of night. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps a trick of her exhausted mind. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, she began to wonder if the house itself had become alive with something malevolent, something that was searching for her, calling to her through the darkened halls. She wasn't the only one to feel it. The servants, once loyal and attentive, began to slip away, their faces pale and drawn. They reported strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, flickering lights that cast shadows in the corners of the rooms, and cold spots that lingered long after the fire had burned out. Some clay. Med too have seen figures in the windows, fleeting glimpses of women dressed in white, their faces obscured by the mist. The Ashford family, they whispered, was cursed, and whatever had claimed the sisters was now coming for them too. It was Henry's brother, Charles, who first saw the figure. He had been staying in one of the guest rooms, attempting to avoid the madness that had taken hold of the family, but sleep eluded him. One evening, as he wandered through the mansion's darkened hallways, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing by the grand staircase. At first he thought it was one of the servants, or perhaps Henry, but the figure was too still, too lifeless. And then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Its eyes. They glowed faintly like twin embers in the darkness. Charles froze, unsure whether to call out or to run, but before he could move, the figure vanished, disappearing into the folds of the night like a wisp of smoke. He ran to Henry's study, desperate to speak of what he had seen, but when he arrived he found his brother locked inside, muttering to himself. "The price has been paid," Henry whispered over and over again, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his desk. "We've all paid it. It's coming." Charles, taken aback by his brother's state, could only watch in horror as Henry's eyes glazed over, as though something had taken hold of him, some unseen force that had already broken his mind. It was in that moment that Charles realized the full extent of the curse. It was not just a family tragedy, it was something far more insidious. Something that had been festering in the Ashford bloodline for generations, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the days that followed, the manifestations became more frequent. Margaret began seeing Evelyn and Isabel in the mirrors, pale, ghostly versions of her daughters, their faces twisted in silent screams. She would turn away, her heart racing, but when she looked back they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. The family began to fracture. Charles grew more paranoid, his nerves frayed as he too began to experience strange visions. He would be sitting alone in the drawing room, his mind heavy with the weight of the family's history, when he would hear footsteps approaching, light and delicate like the tread of a woman's foot. He would turn to find no one there. It was as if the mansion itself had become a living, breathing entity with its own malevolent intentions. But it wasn't just the spirits of the lost sisters that seemed to haunt the family, it was the house itself. The very air in the mansion grew thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching them at all times. The servants refused to go near the lake, too afraid of the strange, black waters that seemed to ripple unnaturally at night. The family avoided the upper floors, where the oldest rooms were said to be cursed. Rooms where no one had dared to sleep in for years. Even Henry, who had once ruled over the estate with an iron will, now avoided the mansion's darkest corners. The walls seemed to close in around them, their once pristine surroundings now infected with an overwhelming sense of dread. The family's mental states deteriorated rapidly. Margaret no longer slept, pacing the halls through the night, convinced that she was being watched. Charles took to locking himself away in his room, afraid to venture beyond the confines of his door. Even the once proud Henry began to unravel, his mind fraying at the edges as the curse tightened its grip on him, and all the while the figure, the shadowy presence, was there, lurking just beyond the threshold of their sight, waiting. The house was alive with fear, each member of the Ashford family now trapped within its walls, prisoners of their own paranoia. The truth was undeniable. The curse had come home. As the investigation into the disappearance of Evelyn and Isabel Ashford continued to drag on, the search for answers led the authorities to a chilling discovery, one that would shatter the very fabric of the family's history. In the weeks leading up to their vanishing, the sisters had not been idle. They had been digging into the Ashford family's past, uncovering fragments of a truth that would unravel everything they thought they knew about their bloodline. Evelyn, always the more inquisitive of the two, had begun spending long hours in the family library, a cavernous, dust-filled room that had been locked away from the eyes of most of the household. It was here, among the leather-bound volumes and yellowed pages, that she had unearthed a collection of old letters written by her ancestors, some dating back centuries. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky, as if written by trembling hands, but it was the contents of those letters that held the key to the curse. The letters spoke of a pact, made by Jonathan Ashford, the patriarch of the family, with a dark entity. It was not just a vague agreement, it was a detailed and binding contract that had been passed down through the generations, each heir unwillingly accepting the price of their family's success. The letters also spoke of a prophecy, one that had been hidden away for years, carefully concealed from the rest of the family. It was the prophecy that intrigued Evelyn the most. She had found it written in the back of one of the journals, scrawled in a frantic, almost delirious hand. The words were chilling, as if they had been written with the knowledge of an impending doom. The bloodline of Ashford will remain unbroken, but only at the cost of its heirs. With each generation, a sacrifice must be made. The daughters will vanish, their spirits bound to the earth, their blood spilled to fulfill the curse. Only in their absence will the Ashfords survive. Evelyn had stared at the words for hours, the weight of their meaning sinking in like a slow, creeping poison. She had gone to Isabel, showing her the journal entry, hoping for some form of relief, some explanation that could make sense of the madness that had gripped their family. But Isabel had recoiled in horror, her face pale and strained. "No," Isabel had whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "It can't be true. This is just superstition. These are old myths, stories from a time we don't even understand." But Evelyn wasn't convinced. She felt the truth in her bones, as if the house itself was whispering the same message to her. The sisters had been marked from the moment they were born. The prophecy, the curse, it wasn't just some ancient tale. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had been waiting for them. In the days that followed, Evelyn's obsession with the prophecy deepened. She scoured the mansion for more clues, uncovering old family heirlooms that spoke of the curse in cryptic ways. An antique pocket watch, its hands forever frozen at midnight, a silver pendant shaped like a serpent eating its own tail representing eternity, and an endless cycle of sacrifice. The most chilling find, however, came when Evelyn stumbled upon an old family tree, carefully etched into a piece of parchment. The tree was familiar at first, until she noticed the unsettling gaps. The names of Ashford ancestors, some marked by strange symbols, were crossed out in red ink, but the most disturbing detail was the line that connected her and Isabel to the very heart of the family tree. Beneath their names, written in jagged, hurried script, was the simple, horrifying word, sacrifice. Isabel had been reluctant to believe it at first, but the more they uncovered, the more undeniable the truth became. The Ashford bloodline had been bound by a curse, and the sisters were its next victims. They had been chosen long before they were born, marked as the final heirs to fulfill the pact made by Jonathan Ashford centuries ago. But what did it mean? How could it be that two young women, just beginning their lives, could be so thoroughly entwined in a curse that had claimed their ancestors for generations? Evelyn's mind raced, her thoughts spinning in a dizzying whirlwind. The curse was real. It was not some tale of superstition. The sisters were destined to vanish, their lives snuffed out to satisfy an ancient bargain. The more Evelyn pieced together, the clearer the pattern became. The Ashford family had prospered for centuries, its wealth and power growing with each passing generation. But with each generation's success, a price had to be paid. An heir, usually a daughter, would disappear, vanishing without a trace, taken by the curse. It was a sacrifice that ensured the family's legacy would continue, that their bloodline would remain unbroken. But at what cost? The lives of the daughters, it seemed, were always the price. It was then that Evelyn and Isabel understood the terrible truth. They were the final offering. They were the last heirs, the last of the Ashford bloodline. The prophecy had been waiting for them, for this moment when their lives would be taken to fulfill the ancient pact that had been sealed long ago. But something in Evelyn's mind rebelled against this fate. She refused to accept it. She began to formulate a plan, a desperate hope that she could somehow break the cycle, free herself and Isabel from the curse that had haunted their family for centuries. She pored over the old family journals, searching for any shred of hope, any hint that the curse could be undone. But the more she searched, the more hopeless it seemed. The curse was inescapable. The more she learned, the clearer it became. There was no breaking the cycle. There was no escaping their fate. As Evelyn and Isabel stood on the precipice of this horrifying revelation, the world around them began to change. The mansion, once a place of comfort and security, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in around them. The shadows grew longer, the whispers louder, and the figure, the shadowy presence that had been lurking in the corners of their vision, grew more distinct. It was waiting for them, waiting to take them. And as the sisters realized that they had been marked for death from the moment of their birth, the house seemed to groan in response, as if it too understood the inevitable. It had been weeks of searching, of empty hope and of despair. The mansion had fallen into a deep silence after Evelyn and Isabel's disappearance. The once bustling halls were now eerily still, the air thick with the suffocating weight of uncertainty. The Ashford family had reached the point of surrender. They no longer knew whether the sisters were lost to some unfathomable tragedy or whether they had simply vanished to escape the curse that had ensnared their bloodline for centuries. But then, on one storm-lashed evening, something unimaginable happened. The family was gathered in the drawing room, their faces drawn and tired, the last remaining embers in the fireplace casting flickering shadows against the walls. It was Margaret who first heard it, a soft sound, like the faintest tapping at the window. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. She rose from her seat and approached the window, her heart racing in her chest, but when she looked outside, all she saw was a blur of rain and darkness. No figure, no movement, only the endless storm. But when she turned around, she froze. There, standing in the doorway, were Evelyn and Isabel. They had returned. For a long moment, the family could only stare, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The sisters stood there in silence, drenched to the bone, their hair matted against their faces, their clothes torn and caked with dirt. They were back, but they weren't the same. At first glance, they appeared as though they had just stepped out of a nightmare. Their skin was pale, almost sickly, as if the life had been drained from them. Their eyes, once bright with life and vitality, were now hollow, dark pools that seemed to swallow up the very light around them. There was something unnatural about their gaze, something detached, as though they were no longer fully present in this world. Their faces, once so full of expression, were now frozen in a state of eerie calm, as if they were marionettes controlled by a hand unseen. The family rushed to them, calling their names, but the sisters did not respond. They stood motionless, as though unaware of their presence. It was only when Margaret reached out to touch Evelyn's arm that the silence was broken. Evelyn's head snapped to the side, her eyes locking onto her mother's with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mother," Evelyn said, her voice hollow, devoid of warmth, "you must not ask questions. There is no salvation for us." The words were chilling, and they hung in the air like a curse, heavy and oppressive. Isabel, standing beside her sister, did not speak. She merely stared ahead, her gaze unfocused, her expression blank. Margaret recoiled in horror. "Evelyn? Isabel? What happened to you? Where have you been? Why are you—" But Evelyn cut her off with a sudden, unnatural laugh, a laugh that sounded too deep, too resonant to come from her lips. "We have seen what lies beyond the veil, Mother," Evelyn said, her voice sending a cold tremor through the room. "We have seen the darkness, the things that wait in the place where time does not exist. There is no escape, there is no returning." Henry, still shaken by the loss of his daughters and the weight of the curse pressing down on his soul, stepped forward. "What do you mean? What happened to you? Where did you go?" Isabel finally said, "Poke," her voice quiet, almost ethereal. "We were claimed by the curse, Father. It is not a mere story. It is real, and it has taken us." Her words sent a wave of nausea through Henry. He had been the one to try to dismiss the curse, to believe that his daughters had simply run away to escape their fate. But now, standing before him, the truth was undeniable. His daughters had been taken, not by any ordinary fate, but by the malevolent forces that had ruled their bloodline for generations. "Do not be fooled," Evelyn continued, her eyes now fixed on Henry with an unsettling intensity. "We are not the same. What we have seen, what we have learned, it has changed us. We are no longer your daughters. We are something else, something bound to the pact. Something that cannot be undone." The room seemed to darken at her words, the air thickening, as if the very space around them had begun to warp. Margaret stepped back, her hands trembling. "You're not—" She struggled to speak, to make sense of what was happening. "You're not our daughters anymore." Evelyn's lips curled into a twisted smile and she stepped forward. "We are, but we are also not. We are bound to this house, to this legacy. We were chosen, long before our birth, to fulfill the price that was demanded. The curse had no mercy for us, and it will not stop now." Isabel's gaze flickered briefly, as though she were seeing something beyond the walls of the mansion. Her voice was a mere whisper. "It is coming for all of you. The price has not been fully paid. We were only the beginning." The words were laced with terror, and as they hung in the air, the sound of distant whispers seemed to grow louder, faint, incomprehensible voices that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Margaret screamed and stepped back, her heart pounding as the shadows in the room began to stretch unnaturally, curling like tendrils around the family. Henry stepped in front of his wife, his hands shaking as he tried to reach for his daughters to bring them back to him, but they flinched away from his touch as though it burned them. Evelyn, her hollow eyes fixed on him, spoke once more. "You have no control. You never did." The house itself seemed to groan, the walls trembling with a life of their own. It was as if the Ashford mansion had come alive, responding to the return of the sisters, recognizing them as its own. The very air grew colder, and an oppressive presence filled the room, something ancient, something malicious. The family stood frozen, unable to comprehend the enormity of the moment. Was this really Evelyn and Isabel, or had they been claimed by the curse, twisted into something unrecognizable? Their once vibrant personalities had been consumed by whatever dark force had taken hold of them, leaving behind only hollow vessels, their souls seemingly lost to the curse. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, Evelyn and Isabel turned and began to walk toward the grand staircase, their movements stiff and mechanical. They did not look back, and as they disappeared into the darkness of the upper floors, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence. The family was left in stunned silence, the truth of what had happened now fully realized. The sisters had not simply disappeared, they had been claimed, sacrificed by the curse that had ruled their bloodline for generations, and now, whatever they had become, they were no longer part of the living world. They were something else, something bound to the darkness. The curse was not finished, it had only just begun. The mansion had never felt more alive with malevolent energy. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, suffocating the family with their oppressive weight. As they stood together in the drawing room, the shadow of dread loomed over them, closing in tighter with each passing second. Evelyn and Isabel's return had been nothing short of horrifying, ghosts of the sisters they had once known, now vessels for something far darker. The family could no longer ignore the curse that had shaped their lives. It had returned to claim them, and now they had no choice but to confront it. For days they had been preparing, digging through old journals and letters, trying to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. The basement, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, was where the original pact had been made, where Jonathan Ashford had sealed the family's fate centuries ago. The very heart of the curse lay beneath their feet, and it was there that they would make their last stand. Henry, once a proud and resolute patriarch, was now broken. His once iron-willed gaze had dulled with the weight of the truth. The curse was not just an affliction, it was a part of them, a part of their bloodline, something that could never be undone. He had spent years attempting to ignore it, hoping it would never return, but it had always been waiting, lurking in the shadows of their past. Now, it had come for him, for his family, and he had no idea what to do. Margaret, her mind frayed from the loss of her daughters and the mounting horrors that had consumed their lives, grasped her husband's arm tightly. "We can't let it take us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to end it, once and for all." Charles, standing beside them, looked pale and gaunt, his face haggard with exhaustion. He had seen too much, had witnessed too many inexplicable horrors to deny the truth any longer. "The curse, it's a part of us, isn't it?" His voice broke as he spoke, the weight of the realization settling in. "It's never going to end unless we confront it." The decision was made. The family would go to the basement, where the pact had been sealed all those years ago. They would face the entity that had bound them to this cycle of sacrifice, and they would do whatever it took to end it. They were no longer fighting to save themselves. They were fighting to break free of the shackles that had held them for so long. The basement door creaked open, its hinges groaning under the strain as the family descended into the depths of the mansion. The air grew colder the further they went, until it felt as though they had crossed into another realm entirely. The walls seemed to close in around them, the stone cold and damp beneath their feet. At the far end of the basement there was an altar, ancient, cracked, and covered in bloodstains that had long since dried. The very sight of it sent a chill down their spines. This was where it had all begun. As they gathered around the altar, the darkness seemed to grow, thickening with every breath they took. The air was charged with an energy that was both unnatural and suffocating, as if the very room was alive with malice. Suddenly a voice echoed through the chamber, a low, guttural voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "So, you have come to face me at last," the voice rasped, sending a wave of dread crashing over the family. It was a sound that crawled under their skin, leaving an unshakable feeling of coldness that wrapped around their hearts like a vice. The air crackled with a sudden surge of dark energy, and the figure began to materialize before them. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and indistinct. But as it solidified, they could see its true face, a grotesque, inhuman visage, its eyes like burning coals, its mouth twisted into a grin that was both triumphant and mocking. It was the entity that had made the pact with Jonathan Ashford all those years ago, and it was here to claim its due. "You have done well to come this far," the entity said, its voice dripping with disdain, "but it is too late to undo what has been set in motion. You are mine, all of you, and now one of you must pay the price." The family stood frozen, each member battling a rising panic. They had known this moment was coming, but they had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that there would be another way. That somehow, the curse could be broken without another life being lost. Henry stepped forward, his hands shaking but his voice firm. "We will not offer another sacrifice," he declared, his words defiant. But even as he said them, a sense of dread gripped him. The entity's laugh was a low, rasping sound like the breaking of glass. "You think you have a choice. The blood is already spilled. Your daughters, your very flesh and blood, have already been taken. The price was paid the moment you agreed to the pact, and now it is time to complete it." Suddenly the room seemed to darken, the shadows twisting around them as if the house itself was alive, feeding on their fear. The walls began to tremble, the floor beneath their feet vibrating with an unnatural force. The family backed away, but the entity's presence seemed to consume the space, growing larger, its form reaching out toward them, hungry for the final sacrifice. The family looked at each other, their minds racing. Who would it be? Who would the entity demand as payment for their sins? Evelyn and Isabel, now barely human, appeared from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on their family. They had come to bear witness to the culmination of the curse, to watch the price that must be paid. Isabel stepped forward, her voice a whisper. "We knew it would come to this. We knew we would be the ones to end it." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward her sister, and then back to their parents. "It has always been our fate," she said softly. "Now we fulfill it." The entity's voice boomed triumphant. "Choose. Who will you sacrifice?" Henry and Margaret stood together, their hearts torn. They had already lost so much. Was it possible to lose one more? Their minds were clouded by grief, by guilt, by the horrifying reality that they were now facing a fate worse than death itself. The family had no choice. The curse had come for them all. In the final terrible moment, the family was forced to make an impossible decision. One by one, they stepped forward, offering themselves to the entity. The price of the curse was steep, but it was the only way to end it. In a final, wrenching act of self-sacrifice, the Ashford family paid the price for their bloodline's sins. As the last breath was taken, the mansion fell silent. The entity, satisfied with its payment, dissolved into the air, its presence vanishing as quickly as it had come. The house, too, seemed to exhale a final breath, as if relieved that the curse had been fulfilled. But the cost was great, and the Ashford legacy was left in ruins. The Ashford mansion stood, as it always had, on the edge of the desolate hill, its walls cracked, windows shattered, and doors sagging under the weight of years. But now there was no warmth left within, no laughter, no footsteps. The once grand halls that had echoed with the sounds of life were now empty, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had descended like a tombstone upon the family's legacy. The curse that had claimed the Ashfords had not been vanquished. It had merely evolved, leaving behind a blood-stained trail of devastation. The house, with its towering spires and decaying grandeur, remained as a reminder of the price the family had paid. But no matter how many years passed, no matter how many dust-covered tomes were buried deep in the mansion's forgotten corners, the truth remained inescapable. The curse of the Ashford name was not so easily broken. Those who came near the mansion, curious thrill-seekers, urban explorers, or those seeking to uncover the mystery of the vanished Ashford sisters, would tell the same story. They spoke of strange occurrences, the unsettling feeling that they were being watched, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end as they walked through the desolate rooms. But it was the whispers that drew them back, over and over again, the whispers of Evelyn and Isabel. It began as a faint sound, something like the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But it grew louder, clearer, as if something or someone was calling from within. "Help us, They would hear breathless voices, faint but undeniable, echoing from the darkness of the house. The whispers called to anyone who ventured too close, and though no one could say for certain whether they were truly the voices of the sisters, something in the air shifted. The curse had not been satisfied with the final sacrifice, it had only deepened its hold. Those who dared to listen longer would hear more than whispers. They would hear cries of pain, of desperation, as if the sisters' souls remained trapped, bound to the house, forever tormented by the deal made so long ago. Even the bravest explorers began to report strange visions, flashes of pale faces in the windows, figures glimpsed through the fog of time, their eyes empty, pleading for release. The Ashford sisters had never truly left. They had become something else, something far darker. The mansion itself seemed to mourn its inhabitants, decaying faster with each passing year. What had once been an imposing fortress of wealth and power was now an empty shell, hollowed out by years of neglect and the lingering presence of the curse. The iron gates rusted, the garden choked with weeds, and the grand staircase that once led to rooms full of life now stood cold and empty, a monument to the family's tragic fall. But the mansion had not been abandoned by all. The Ashford name still lingered. In the town below the hill, whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk. Some spoke of the house as if it were alive, a sentient being that drew power from the horrors within its walls. They spoke of strange occurrences, the unsettling feeling that they were being watched, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end as they walked through the desolate rooms. But it was the whispers that drew them back, over and over again. The whispers of Evelyn and Isabel. It began as a faint sound, something like the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, but it grew louder, clearer, as if something or someone was calling from within. "Help us," they would hear, breathless voices, faint but undeniable, echoing from the darkness of the house. The whispers called to anyone who ventured too close, and though no one could say for certain whether they were truly the voices of the sisters, something in the air shifted. The curse had not been satisfied with the final sacrifice, it had only deepened its hold. Those who dared to listen longer would hear more than whispers. They would hear cries of pain, of desperation, as if the sisters' souls remained trapped, bound to the house, forever tormented by the deal made so long ago. Even the bravest explorers began to report strange visions, flashes of pale faces in the windows, figures glimpsed through the fog of time, their eyes empty, pleading for release. The Ashford sisters had never truly left. They had become something else, something far darker. The mansion itself seemed to mourn its inhabitants, decaying faster with each passing year. What had once been an imposing fortress of wealth and power was now an empty shell, hollowed out by years of neglect and the lingering presence of the curse. The iron gates rusted, the garden choked with weeds, and the grand staircase that once led to rooms full of life now stood cold and empty, a monument to the family's tragic fall. But the mansion had not been abandoned by all. The Ashford name still lingered in the town below the hill, whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk. Some spoke of the house as if it were alive, a sentient being that drew power from the horrors within its walls. They spoke of strange occurrences in the surrounding village, sudden disappearances, unsettling visions of the dead, and a creeping sense of dread that seemed to stretch out from the mansion and touch everything in its wake. The bloodline, it seemed, had not been completely severed. In the years that followed the Ashford family's tragic end, new faces appeared in the town, strangers with eyes too old for their years, a quietness that ran too deep. Some said they were descendants of the Ashfords, though none could say for certain. The town had learned long ago not to ask too many questions. Some things were better left in the shadows. As for the house itself, no one dared live there. Not anymore. It was said that the Ashford mansion had become cursed beyond salvation, that no one who stepped foot inside could ever escape its grasp. Every attempt to demolish the place, every effort to tear it down and rebuild, ended in failure. The workers who came with plans to raise the mansion were met with strange accidents, inexplicable tragedies. The foundations were said to resist all attempts at destruction, as though the house itself had become an entity determined to remain standing as a testament to its dark history. And still, the whispers persisted. They had begun as a faint sound, but now they were louder, more insistent, and those who ventured close enough could hear the Ashford sisters, their voices etched in pain, begging for release. The sisters had been marked from birth, destined to suffer the curse of their bloodline, but even in death they remained bound to the house, unable to break free from the deal their ancestor had made. They were the cursed heirs, trapped forever in the shadow of their family's sins, their souls crying out in torment. The curse, it seemed, was eternal. The mansion, decaying and forgotten, remained at the center of it all, a place where the past and present collided. The Ashford family's legacy was not a tale that could be buried or forgotten. It was a wound that would never heal, an open scar in the earth that would remain, festering and rotting for all eternity. And so the Ashford name, once synonymous with wealth and power, became a symbol of horror, a whispered warning to those who would dare seek answers. The bloodline, though broken, still haunted the land, its legacy forever tied to the dark entity that had claimed it. The mansion, abandoned but never forgotten, stood as a silent witness to the unbroken chain of tragedy, a place where the past continued to haunt the present, and where the Ashford sisters' cries echoed through the ages. The curse of the Ashford family had not ended. It had only just begun, and those who dared to come too close would find that they too were marked by the legacy of blood and secrets that could never be undone.